Hi students, in this video I'm going to summarize the last chapter on the end of Cold War. So this is an overview of the chapter. You can see from the start, we're going to cover the superpower relations from 1960s, which was where the Cuban Missile Crisis ended from our last chapter. And then we're going to move on to long-term development, some of the factors that affected USSR, why they lost the Cold War. And then we move on to short-term factors where we focus on how Gorbachev's action caused the USSR to collapse. And we're going to also, in the last part, just go through a few events that led to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, so how did the Soviet Union actually collapse step by step? All right, so it's quite a big chunk chapter, so I'm going to speed through some parts, okay, and focus on the main factors, which are these factors, okay? Okay, so we know that in the early 1780s, okay, a lot of countries, we learned they were stockpiling nuclear weapons, so the world was getting very dangerous. Okay, 1980s, however, the situation became more peaceful. So we're going to see how the coming of Gorbachev and the changing of leaders affected the peaceful relations between the countries. So sometimes it got worse, sometimes it got better. All right. And these are some of the key US leaders. Okay, so some of the key US leaders that we have learned so far, at least in the last chapter, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, in this chapter, the main star we are going to focus on will be Ronald Reagan, who was the president in the 80s, which the Gorbachev was also the leader of the USSR at that time. So there are two interactions would lead to USSR's decline, collapse. And in Soviet Union, our main star will inevitably be Gorbachev, was the last leader of the Soviet Union. Okay. All right. So what were some of their relations like between the 60s and 70s? So we're going to focus on these two parts: reduction of tension and the abandonment of détente. Okay. So détente means to have to try and build friendly relationships again. Okay, later you can see what it means. Okay, so we're gonna look at these two parts: how they became friendly and suddenly became not friendly again within this 60s to 70s. Okay, so why did they reduce tension? When you say reduce tension, we are looking at, you know, arms reduction, and we're also looking at like the countries itself, they are less unfriendly to each other. So one of the reasons why the tension was reduced was because the successor to Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis was very aggressive towards the Soviet Union, willing to play nuclear weapons to, you know, be tough on their opponents. But his successor, Nixon, President Nixon, abandoned this sort of a hostile policy and decided, you know, it's not worth it to be so hostile and unfriendly to the Soviet Union. Okay, so he dropped the containment policy and decided to build relations. Okay, so what does this mean? It means they do not want to maybe disturb each other. They do not want to interfere with each other's influence that much. So let's let them be. You know, life can go on as usual. Okay, so they reduce direct conflict, and one of the reasons why they may want to avoid direct conflict also because at that time both countries seems to be on an equal footing. They have nuclear parity. Both countries have almost equally strong nuclear weapons. Both sides have nuclear weapons. Both sides don't dare to use nuclear weapons on each other. So there was this sort of a peace and deterrence also. So there's no need to go and threaten the other party because you don't want them to retaliate with the nuclear weapons, right? So there was this sort of uneasy peace. Okay. However, you know, both sides, although they try to be friendly, be cool, but they still, of course, some of them still believe that, you know, their own ideology is better. Their own allies are more important than their enemy, of course. Okay, so there was still some potential that relationship can get worse, and it did get worse, as we'll see. Okay, so from the Soviet Union side, Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev. So again, remember Khrushchev, aggressive, sort of playing with fire during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So like Kennedy's successor, Khrushchev's successor, Brezhnev was also more willing to, build up more calm relationship with the USA. So this can come into various treaties, okay? And they want, again, like I said, they want to basically reduce arms, so strategic arms limitation treaty. So basically some sort of arms reduction will reduce the tension. Okay, some of the examples, USA pressuring North Vietnam to sign a peace treaty, telling them, at this time, this is not really in your syllabus, but at this time, Vietnam, there was a Vietnam War. It was basically a proxy war between North and USA and Soviet Union. There was North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and eventually North Vietnam won, which was the communist side. And after they won the war, Soviet Union pressure asked the Vietnamese, say like, you can sign a peace treaty with the USA. It's all good. You have already united the country. Okay, so that was the Vietnam War. And trade treaties, you can remember the most favored nation status. This means that the USA would treat Soviet Union as a sort of a equal trade partner. So maybe this could mean things like very less tariffs or less taxes, if you will. Okay, because remember when we trade with other countries, sometimes we like to impose taxes to collect some money and to protect your own local businesses. So when you say I'm your most favored nation to trade with, it means, maybe I wouldn't have to tax you so much or don't tax at all. Okay, and USA also supplied grain to USSR. So these things were maybe unthinkable in the past at the height of the Cold War. Okay. However, there were also attempts to reverse this. Okay, so abandon détente, that means the relationship became sort of hostile again. Why were this? So not everyone obviously agreed to détente. Okay, some people, you can see first paragraph here, some of the Russian leaders think it's a loss of face, to be friendly with your enemy is unthinkable. And some people think that, especially USA, we need to remain more superior than the USSR. Being equal to them is not good enough. We must continue to build up arms. Instead of reducing arms, we need to continue to build up arms so we continue to be stronger. If the other side have nuclear weapons, we must have more nuclear weapons, more powerful nuclear weapons. Okay. Some of the US leaders that were tough include Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter, now we skip a few years. So now 1976 was quite tough on the USSR. And later we will learn President Reagan was also quite tough. Okay. And partly because a lot of them, they are not just because they are against the USSR for being a powerful country, but USSR at the time had a very shady human rights. Just remember from the time of Stalin, communism, there's not a lot of freedom in the country. You can't criticize the Communist Party. In terms of the economy, it's a command economy, so you don't really have much of a say on where you work, what you work, how much you are paid, and things like that. Okay, so there wasn't a great deal of human rights, and the USA is big on freedom, big on human rights. So naturally, they don't support such treatment in the Soviet Union. Okay, and at the same time, USA and USSR, they continue to also support, continue to take part in a lot of proxy wars. So we learned that there was Korean proxy war, learned that there was Vietnam proxy war. So the US and USSR continue to be part of all these proxy wars overseas. And when you have proxy wars, although you're not fighting each other directly, but there is fighting and the relationship will definitely be cut. Okay, so some of the examples like Angola Civil War, you just need to remember this name, you don't need to know what happened. Same thing with Afghanistan. Okay, the Soviet Union wanted to get into Afghanistan and replace the Afghan government, and the US, on the other hand, supported some of the fighters in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. And one of the fighters goes by the name of Osama bin Laden. So it's quite ironic, the Osama bin Laden that was part of the September 11 terrorist attacks, in the 70s was actually a close ally to the USA in the Afghan-Soviet war. All right. So this is all right. So therefore, there were presidents that were opposing arms limitation. Previously, we said there's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So they start to wind this arms limitation treaty down because they want to build up arms again. Okay, so the relationship go up and down. The arms race also went from intense to becoming less intense. Okay, different leaders like in Britain and in US. Just now we saw Jimmy Carter. So now these two are from the 80s, Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. They were also quite known for being confrontational, being willing to challenge the Soviet Union. And okay, so President Reagan was very tough. He revived the arms race. Just now, as mentioned, he supported the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were the group of Afghan fighters, including Osama bin Laden. Okay, and that's the same for Margaret Thatcher. Okay, US, UK were still very close allies. Okay, so now let's move on to the second section, the end of the Cold War, some of the long-term factors. So these are like the key characteristics of the USSR. That means it has always been with the USSR for many, many years, that can explain why the USSR eventually fell and lost the Cold War. Same thing, we're going to look at how the US was much better than the USSR in many areas for many, many years, since the end of World War II to the 1980s. Okay, so long-term factors, you can see we focus on the superiority of the American system. They're going to look at the weakness and problems of the communist system. So that means these problems existed regardless of who the leaders were. That means it was a problem in the ideology, different in the way the country was run. Okay, because of communism versus capitalism. So these two differences would affect the country for very long in very great ways. Okay. On the other hand, later we'll see short term, it was more about a leader's policy, what one leader tried to do. Okay, so long term was about the country, the overall structure and direction, where short term was later is because of certain policies. Okay, so in a nutshell, long term factors, you just need to know that it was because of the difference of ideology. Okay, difference between capitalism versus communism. Okay, we look at how the USA was much stronger than the USSR. In what aspects are we going to look at? Mainly in the terms of economy, the US was much richer for most of its period, and the military, the US was also superior compared to the USSR. Okay, and let's go through some of the factors in the next few slides. Okay, so the US was very wealthy during the World War II, most richest country, most powerful country. After World War II, it continued to be so. And one of the reasons in the 70s, 80s especially, the economy of the US expanded, it grew very rich, partly because of this policy called economic liberalization. So what this liberalization, it basically means more capitalism. President Reagan encouraged US business, individuals to do more business, create more jobs, make more money, and this helped to grow the economy. Okay, so at the same time, they basically reduce government expenditure, reduce taxes, so that people will be more willing to work harder. Okay, so more privatization, more businesses. So a lot of big business was helping the economy grow. Okay, and it was very successful. There was a period of economic prosperity, so the country grew very wealthy. Okay, and the gap between USA and USSR grew. Okay, USA became very wealthy. USSR did not grow as much. Okay, and what does that mean? It means if you have a very wealthy USA, you was able to sustain the military cooperation. So more money, stronger economy, you can have more weapons being built. So economy affects the military as well. Stronger economy, stronger military for the US. Okay, so because they were so wealthy, you have more money, the US was able to finance the arms race. And the Soviet Union was very pressured. Its economy was not doing as well, but it felt pressured to also be part of the arms race, because when there's an arms race, you don't try to rival your opponent. It means you are threatening your own security. Okay, and one of the arms race important example that we often like to use is the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars program, or the space arms race. Just imagine the US had a lot of money, a lot of loose cash. It was able to build new weapons, and one of the crazy new weapons that they thought was, having a satellite-based system to shoot down nuclear missiles heading towards your country, as well as to fire offensive weapons, probably. Okay, so also known as the Star Wars program. Okay, so very sadly, fortunately, I think the USA didn't gone down that route, but it has the resources to plan for it. Okay, the Soviet Union unfortunately had no money, had no scientific resources to match the USA in this space race. So in the long run, the US military, you can explain, it will only get stronger and stronger and stronger. And at some point, the USSR may be of no match to the USA. And the USSR, if there's a conflict with the USA, may lose the war and be forced to collapse like in this way. Okay, and there was a lot of tensions, okay, because of the arms race. So not just in crazy weapons like space, but also in normal weapons like nuclear missiles and all this. Okay, there was a lot of tension. You can see from this map, the blue represents the allies and the red represents the communist bloc. There are a lot of missiles aimed at each other. Okay. All right, and this is a small example that I didn't want to go through, but Able Archery is basically an incident that, they almost went to war with each other. The USA had a drill, and the USSR thought it was a real thing and tried to mobilize its military, and it almost led to another sort of killer missile crisis. Okay, but I think I will skip through this example. Okay, so more long-term factors. Okay, so why was the US system of capitalism so much better than the communist system of the USSR? So we go through a bit more of the theory, okay, of the two ideology. Okay, there are structural weakness. Structural weakness means communism was flawed. Communism was doomed to fail. Communism was doomed to fail to begin with, compared to capitalism. Okay, and just to recall, communism, you have a command economy. The state tells you what to produce, tells factory what to produce. They control all aspects of production. So whatever things people want to farm, people want to make factories, the state decide what to build and the quantity, to create a classless society. So there are no bosses, owners versus workers. Everyone is a worker. Okay, and the problem with such a system is because the economy is so complex, you don't have information to make all the decisions or make the right decisions. And there was a lot of corruption leading to a lot of inefficiency, poor quality control. Later, I'll give you an analogy. Okay, so imagine you're a canteen vendor. You do business at the canteen, you sell food. Is it better to let the canteen vendor decide what to sell and how much to sell, or to let maybe the school principal decide? Most of you will obviously be thinking, let the canteen do it, because the canteen vendor knows his or her stuff. Now, what would the principal know about what to cook and how much to cook when he or she is not there at the canteen, doesn't know what's the business like, doesn't know what customers like? So same thing in communism. If you try to control every aspect of the economy and every production, if you're a government official, you try to control everything, you might not always make the best decision compared to the people working in the factory themselves who knows what people want. Okay, and the other problem with the command economy, besides lack of information, is the lack of motivation. When you are creating a classless society, everyone is equal, you get a similar pay, people will not be motivated to work hard. People will not be motivated to produce good quality goods. So this hurts your economy as well, because the economy is poor quality. Okay, same thing, canteen vendor. You get to keep how much you get to make profits and earn more. You'll be willing to work harder compared to say you're being paid a fixed salary like in a communist system. Okay, so the USSR's economy was very ineffective, very inefficient. There were a lot of resentment towards the communist way of doing things. All right, and you remember that even from the time of Stalin all the way back in chapter 2, we learned that this led to, sometimes it was good because the government can pump in a lot of resources to produce a lot of things, but sometimes it doesn't always work out because especially consumer goods, things like consumers goods tend to be neglected by the government. Okay, they usually want to produce other things. Okay, and the government often devoted a lot of resources to the military, which means that things like consumer goods, things that people actually use are often neglected, and these are things that will make your life happier, right? So people lost faith in communism because it was a poor system. People were doing badly. The goods produced were very poor quality. People are not motivated to work hard. So overall, it's a very bad way of running things. Okay. All right. So arms race. Let's skip this. Okay. So this applies not just to the USSR, but also to all the countries that were sort of dependent on the USSR, the satellite states in Eastern Europe. Remember, at that time, the USSR was also trying to support its allies in its economy. So when it was doing very badly itself, now you still need to support many of your poor allies in Eastern Europe. It's an extra burden on the USSR also. Okay, and they were doing so badly that they have to resort to bartering, direct trading on goods, because money was short and things like that. So the economy of Eastern Europe was also terrible, and that is also a reason why many of the countries in Eastern Europe that were communist eventually will break away from the USSR and become a sort of democratic capitalist country in the 80s. Okay, so like I said, there was a burden to the Soviet Union. Okay, and because of that, there was a lot of nationalistic movement. That means people were there were a lot of move to independent. People were desiring sort of independence. That means I don't want to be so dependent on the Soviet Union. I don't want to be part of the communist bloc. And there were people that are pushing and trying to change things. Okay, and things like Hungarian Revolution and things like that. Okay, however, at this point in time, in the early 60s, 70s, the Soviet Union was weak, but not that weak. It still have a very strong influence. So when there were leaders that tried to take away these satellite states, move them away from the influence of the Soviet Union, they can be replaced or be suppressed. Okay, so that was it. Okay, so we talk about both why America was so superior in their ways. We also talk about how communism system did not really work. Okay, these were in not just in the 80s but you can think of it in terms of in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. The communism system has always been like this. The US system has always been like this. So it led to a very big gap between US and the USSR. Okay, so that was long-term factors. All right, so now I will look at some of the short-term factors. So how Gorbachev's actions led to the end of the USSR as we know it. Okay, so short-term factors now. Okay, so there were a lot of problems faced by the Soviet Union. We covered that. Okay, things like the combined economy did not work. Okay, just a moment. So there was poor decision by the central government. Okay, we talk about how this was the weakness of the communist system because they cannot make decisions, accurate decisions all the time. It's very hard to micromanage everything. Okay, And what does this mean? That there was a lot of economic problems. Okay, what to produce, how much to produce, they may not always do the right thing. And people often have poor quality goods or have to wait very long to get goods. Okay, poor quality control because people were no motivated to make good stuff. As long as you hit target, you produce the number, you are good, you pass. So poor quality goods. Okay, and people generally led very terrible lives. Okay, compared to the US, compared to the capitalist countries. And at the same time, we talk about how there was a lot of heavy military spending because both USA and USSR was caught in the arms race. Okay, so it didn't help. Like, your economy was bad and you had to use whatever wealth you created on military spending, which did not directly benefit people. Okay, alcoholism, this one in USSR, people were doing very badly in terms of their, managing their own life because life was terrible. So people turned to alcohol. Okay, farming wise, it was also lagging behind compared to Western countries who were more efficient, producing more with less resources. Okay, basic needs was not met in effective government. So people were very unhappy, starting to get very unhappy with the Soviet way of doing things and uninterested, okay, because they know they cannot change the feedback. Under communism, it was still an authoritarian regime, okay, so people did not feel like they could change things much. Okay, we talk about arms race also. Both countries were spending a lot of money, but the USA had the money to spend, so the USSR was lagging behind, trying to catch up, and people in various Soviet states start to feel anti-Soviet feelings. We talked about that already also. Okay, so now let's look at some of the short-term factors. So how the arrival of one man, Gorbachev, and maybe to some extent Reagan, what did he try to do to change the USSR? And when he tried to change the USSR, what consequence does it have on the USSR? How did it lead to more impact that directly caused the USSR to collapse? So think of long-term developments as like let's say I ask you why did I break my arm, for example? Long-term development could be maybe I'm a manual worker. I lift a lot of things. So I injure, I strain my arm a lot. But short-term development could be one day, I was on a very particularly tough shift and the arm started to break or get strained. So we're going to look at what are some of the triggers that caused the USSR to fall. Okay, and what was Gorbachev's role in it. So including some of its policies, we'll go into the details. Okay, so Gorbachev was a more modern leader, and he thought that, communism, we don't always have to stay with it. He was starting to become irrelevant. So he was young, he had new ideas to run the country. Okay, and at that time, remember, we talked about they were in an arms race and they were spending so much military. So Gorbachev was also questioning at the time, is it really worth it to continue throwing money at the military just to keep up with the USA? Could we do other things? Okay, later we'll see some of the other things that they do. Okay, so they started to consider reforms. Okay, reforms means they want to change the country, the way it's run. Maybe not communism. So you can see from this cartoon, Gorbachev is pointing in a different direction compared to Stalin, Lenin, and this is Karl Marx. Okay, so he was less ideologically motivated than his predecessors. That means he was open to ideologies, to other ideologies. So it doesn't always have to be the communist ways of doing things. Maybe a bit of capitalist way of doing things would be good. Okay, some of you would know that many of the communist countries today that we know of, China, Vietnam, they all have a bit of capitalism in the country, their businesses and all this, because people know that communism have serious problems. So they also are willing to change. Okay, so Gorbachev questioned whether the command economy will work, and he questioned whether continued competition with the US on the military side is a wise idea. Okay, so he wanted to overhaul the military industrial complex. This is a very serious, but basically all you need to know is in the past the USSR military industrial, you see military, you see industry. That means the industry is used to support the military. Okay, that means it's a military first kind of approach. So the Gorbachev also started, maybe we don't have to worry so much about the military. Let's use the economy. Let's get the factories to produce other things, other consumer goods that people may actually want to use. Okay, so he wants to change all of this. And what's the point of this? To restore people's confidence. You will notice that it still says communist ideals because fundamentally the country is still a communist country, right? Even though you introduce a little bit of more capitalist kind of reforms, overall you still want to preserve your identity as a communist country. So you want people to think that communists can actually work. It's quite flexible. Okay. So what were some of the policies that you want to know of? So there are at least two policies you want to know of: Glasnost and Perestroika. Maybe also some of its foreign policy. Okay, Glasnost basically means more openness, more transparency, or like I tell my students, more freedom. Okay, you are now able to criticize the government. And why is that important? Because people at that time were very unhappy with the Soviet Union, but they couldn't voice out. They quietly resent the Soviet Union. As a result, they hate the country very much. So now they are saying, let's give the people an outlet to vent. So when you vent, you rant, sometimes you feel happier, right? So that's roughly the idea. You allow people to speak up so they feel like, I'm not being oppressed here. So they will support the country a little bit more. And at the same time, when people rant and give feedback, you might sometimes get good ideas also to how to run the country, what you need to do. So that can also improve the country. Okay, so it was to give people opportunities to express themselves. Okay, without persecution. That means you can now criticize. You Stalin can criticize Khrushchev, okay, for the wrong things that they did. All this is to encourage people to give useful feedback. Okay, unfortunately, there were good consequences, but there were also bad consequences in terms of the USSR. Okay, so when there's more freedom of expression, more freedom to information, people start to become aware of how the US and the West were doing so much better than a communist country. People start to become very critical. They start to become very upset with the situation. In the past, you could be doing very badly, but if I censor the news, you don't know how well other countries are doing, you might not feel so lousy. But now with less censorship, you get to find out more information about other countries, and you realize that your economic situation and military situation is terrible, you start to lose confidence and become very critical. And this applies to countries in East Europe as well. They realize that, West Europe is doing much better than East Europe. Why is that so? The only reason they might blame the Soviet Union for causing that, blame communism for causing that. Okay, so Glasnost basically backfired. Instead of making people more happy with the government, now that they can share freely, people become alienated, become very unhappy with the ways things have been running. Okay, and the next reform you want to know is Perestroika. Just take note of the spelling. Some of you sometimes spell it wrongly, but we don't mark you off for spelling, but it shouldn't be too far off. Okay, so Perestroika are a series of economic and political reforms. The economic side is very straightforward. It means there is now more market economy. That means there is more capitalism kind of idea. People can own businesses, people can get rich, people can own property, become richer than others. Okay, and that the whole point is they want to improve efficiency, they want to improve people's motivation. That's the whole idea of introducing capitalism ideas. Okay, so people they relax the price of goods, they relax the wages, they allow factory managers to decide how much people should be paid based on how well they are doing their jobs. So it's motivating people to work hard, work smart, okay, produce good quality goods. Okay, and at the same time, there was also a political aspect to Perestroika. Just now, Glasnost was freedom of information, freedom of expression. Perestroika is changing the economy as well as the politics side also. So remember, the communists used to be a sort of a one-party system. There weren't really much elections to talk about. Okay, but with Perestroika, the reform, they now allow some sort of general election, let people have a say in their leaders as well. So just now, Perestroika, there was one part about more capitalism, but in the political side, there is also another thing, because more democracy. Okay, when we study USA versus USSR, we always look at the difference in the economy and the politics. One is capitalist, one is communist. One, in terms of politics, one is a democratic country, one is authoritarian. So more democracy, less authoritarian regime. Okay, and that is Perestroika. Change your economy, change your politics. Okay, and what was the impact? Okay, it was well intended, you can imagine, because US system has been doing well, right? If we try to follow that system, our country should benefit. Okay, and in some cases it would have benefited because communism was such an ineffective system. Okay, but there were also many businesses that did not do well. That was very unprofitable. There has been supported by government for a long time, and suddenly the government withdrew their support. Many businesses will find themselves unable to survive. Okay, and the political reform side was also undermined. Okay, because there were people that felt that, some people think he did not do enough. Some people felt that he did not do enough. Some people felt like he did too much. So he was sandwiched between both sides of people. Some people think he shouldn't have changed the communism system because we are a communist country, so they hated him for that. But there were people who wanted change for a very long time and think he did not change enough. So instead of pleasing both sides start to target him. Okay, and he lost a bit of authority. Okay, the third set of reforms that Gorbachev have to do with foreign policy. That means how he deal with other countries. So unlike some of his previous leaders, he tried to introduce some sort of détente again. Just now we mentioned this term, right? To improve relationship with President Reagan and the Western countries. Okay, and some of one example is the Sinatra Doctrine. Sinatra Doctrine basically give people a chance to choose their own path forward. Okay, if you know the song My Way, it gives people the chance to decide whether they want to be communist, to be capitalist, to still be part of the communist bloc of countries, or you want to join the US side. Let them have the choice. Okay, and how did they try to improve relations? Part of it is through disarmament. So once again, they sign a nuclear treaty to try and remove some of the nuclear missiles in Europe. Okay, and Gorbachev itself was also very friendly. Like I said, he allowed each country the right to choose their political and economic system. Do you want democracy or you want authoritarian regime? Do you want communism or do you want capitalism? Give them the choice. Just like how in USSR we got Glasnost and Perestroika, we give people the choice to decide what they want. Okay, so you start to become more open-minded. And if you're the US, you'll be very happy with that because more people will want to convert to capitalism and democracy because it's a good system. So you get more allies now. So it actually promotes the US to be more receptive to the USSR. Okay, so it tried to reduce the ideological warfare, try to reduce mutual suspicion, by reducing the nuclear arms, try to improve relationships for the better. Okay, and choose their own way. There were actually many countries who decided, you know what, I want to move away from the communist system because it has not been working. I want to try something new. USSR, not really good allies. I want to reach out to the US, to the UK. Okay, and how does this hurt USSR? You can imagine you have less allies, you have less people supporting you. So it led to an overall decline in the communist world's power. Okay, you get less allies, you are weaker. Okay, so how did all this, your allies switching sides to the US, your reforms eventually led to the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's look at some of the events now. Okay, these are the key events. Loss of control over Eastern Europe, which is marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall, and eventually the fall of the USSR. So let's just quickly go through that. Okay, so after all the changes that Gorbachev introduced, okay, many Eastern European countries now decided to choose their own system, and they decided to move away from the communist system, move away from the support of the USSR. And the USSR at the time, they decided, you know what, I won't intervene. You want to go, you go. So many Eastern European countries collapsed. There were revolutions. That means they decided to do away with the communist country that they have and increase more democratic countries appeared in its wake. Okay, so countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Germany decided to ditch the communists and unite with West Germany to form a united Germany. So these were some of the countries that moved away from the Soviet influence, moved away from communist system. And the most symbolic one was obviously in Germany, because Germany was one country with two systems, one democratic on the west, one communist in the east, separated by the Berlin Wall. Okay, so for many, many years, this was the place that divided, that shows the ideological divide, the political divide. And now with in 1989, you can see that East Germany's communist leader decided to resign and, allow people the chance to now unite with the West, okay, form a united country, and the Berlin Wall fell, and people that were separated for many decades can now be united easily. In the past, you can't really cross over between East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. Okay, so people were able now to unite with each other, and they were finally reunified as one country under the leader of the West German government. Okay, it's now a new government, but the West German government is basically the one still in charge. Okay, so they tried to reduce mutual suspicion, improve bilateral ties. Gorbachev promised, if you want to go, you go, we won't stop you. And he kept to that promise. When Germany reunified, he was quite, okay with it, quite chill about it, because he know at that time, these countries want to go already. There's no point holding on to them. And at that point, a lot of these countries were economic burden on the USSR. So if you let them go, let them figure their own way out, it reduces the burden on the USSR. USSR can try to fix its own problems. Okay, so that was kind of the thinking why they did not want to, stop them from leaving the Soviet influence. Okay, so in terms of military, okay, like I said, more cooperation. Example you can remember is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty or START. You can't remember this, just remember that there was nuclear disarmament or arms disarmament to reduce the number of weapons, reduce nuclear weapons, to improve relationship, reduce distrust between the country. Okay, so friendlier ties. You can see Gorbachev and Reagan quite happy here with each other. Okay, unimaginable in the past. Okay, because in the past, many of the Soviet and US leaders were so hostile towards each other. You cannot be seen in the same photo, because people will complain and say, why are you taking photo being so friendly with your enemy? Okay, so the USSR also became the next to go. Many Eastern European states go already. The remaining part of USSR also disintegrated. Okay, and a new country. The Soviet Union used to be made of 15 countries, including the Russia was the largest one. So many of the nearby states like Belarus, Georgia, they all start to break up and go apart. Okay, and Gorbachev eventually lost power. There were people that were threatening to stage a coup and get rid of him, but this guy Boris Yeltsin supported him for a while, but eventually even Boris Yeltsin thought, Gorbachev, his time is up, it's his time to go, and Boris Yeltsin became decided to suspend the Communist Party eventually, and he made himself the new president of the new country in Russia. Okay, so Gorbachev eventually resigned officially in 1991, more like forced to resign, and Soviet Union is no more. Okay, so many of the countries like Belarus, Ukraine, all broke away, became their own independent country. So this country is traditionally part of the Soviet Union. before World War II started, they were part of the Soviet Union already. And even this country decided to break away. And we are left with Russia as well as all these other independent countries. Okay, so communism, and at this time, communism, at least in the Soviet Union side, effectively ended. And the USSR broke out into all these many small little states. Of course, Russia today is still the big part of it. It's still a very big country. Okay, so this is the fall of the USSR. So I hope this has been a very long video, but I hope you find useful. And as you go into your prelims and your O levels, I hope some of these videos that I made over the past few years, you find them useful for your revision. And I really wish you all the best. If you have any questions about any of the chapter, the topics, do try your best to revise using your revision booklet, your notes, check with your friends, check with your teachers if you really need to. Okay, so take care and thank you for watching the videos. All right, bye-bye.